Hello, my name is Dr. Jim Junker. I'm a research assistant professor at the University of North Texas. I'm a stream ecologist that's interested in the movement of energy and elements through ecosystems and kind of how that's related to aspects of biological diversity. Thank you very much for that introduction. Am I audible? Is this working? All right, great. Yes, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you all for coming out today. I'm going to talk a lot about what I'm interested in, and specifically focusing on the role of temperature in the patterns of energy flow through ecosystems, food web dynamics, and community assembly. And to start out, let's first go back and look at a little bit of our history. And so this is an example of a stripe diagram. And so what this shows is each of these vertical bars represents a single year, and the color of that bar represents the mean annual temperature relative to the whole series. What's very starkly apparent when you look at this is that when you start back here at 1880 or so and you move towards the present, very clearly we see many more of these years are these warmer temperatures. These are represented by this very clear pattern of warming on the planet. And this pattern at the global scale also influences patterns at local scale. So these are two examples that are about over a decade old each. But what they show is that for both lakes and reservoirs and streams and rivers across broad geographical areas, we see variability, but similar trends of upward trending temperatures in these habitats. And why is this important? Why are we interested in temperature at all? Right? We know that the temperature is a fundamental physical, chemical, and biological process, right? So, and it operates at even the smallest scale. So if you look at for instance, the rates of enzymatic processes within cells, so subcellular processes, we see this kind of similar form that emerges qualitatively, that the rates of the enzymatic rates, as you move through temperature, they kind of increase exponentially to some optimal, and then they have this sharp drop off past that optimal temperature. And this form, this qualitative form, kind of manifests at different levels of biological organization. So we want to just kind of take this and use this to predict patterns and processes, not just at the subcellular level, but also moving on upwards from cells to populations to communities and whole ecosystems. But we know that as we move across these biological levels of organization, we're increasing complexity, we're increasing in spatiotemporal scales. And so while we would just like to be able to predict from these kind of first principles and from these mechanisms at subcellular levels, we know that things become a little bit more difficult as you get up in these higher levels of organization. But this process of kind of trying to scale from these mechanistic patterns at subcellular processes can be really powerful in understanding the shortcomings of our current theoretical models, and also understanding when certain processes and larger scale processes start to become much more important. And so one of these examples of trying to scale from subcellular processes to whole ecosystems, probably the most influential one of the last 30 years, is the metabolic theory of ecology. And so this theory has been especially powerful because it recognizes kind of that fundamental aspect of what makes life, that all organisms undergo metabolism, and that much of the variation in metabolism that you see across from microbes to whales can be explained by two factors, right? By body size, so as you move from small things to big things, they require more energy, and temperature. And so as you move from cold things to cold habitats to warm habitats, individual metabolism increases. And the utility of the metabolic theory is really plays out in that fact that it's really general. It's meant to apply universally across all organisms on the planet, and it can be used to scale from organism scales to ecosystem scales. And so we're going to kind of leverage this theory to ask, how does temperature specifically influence energy flow through animal communities? And so first off, let's talk about what I mean when I say energy flow. So first off, the secondary production is one aspect of energy flows through a community. Specifically, it's the accumulation of biomass, of specifically heterotrophic biomass, through time. So it's an ecosystem flux that occurs over some spatial area and over some temporal scale. And it can be broken down into kind of two of these broader processes. Specifically, the biomass, so how much stuff is in a place, and then how quickly that biomass turns over. So biomass turnover times biomass is ultimately this process of secondary production. And metabolic theory makes some predictions about how each of these processes, these sub-processes, should scale with temperature specifically. And so let's walk through just what some of those predictions are. First off, when we look at these patterns from these predictions from metabolic theory, we see that both biomass and biomass turnover have a mass, their scale with mass, as well as they scale with temperature through this Arrhenius term that we apply here. And importantly, when you look at these equations, they share both exponents for the mass part, and this term E, which we call the activation energy. This is shared across these processes. And so they're both predicted to be about 0.65. And these other two terms in this Arrhenius equation, this is the Boltzmann constant and then absolute temperature. So these are fixed within a system. And so what I think one of the clear kind of fundamental aspects of what this predicts is that for both mass and temperature, we have this prediction of a constant or an invariant secondary process of secondary production. However, there's one really important assumption baked into this, and that is that this assumes constant resource availability. And we know that temperature and resource availability can be intertwined. For instance, the rates of gross primary production, so the amount of primary biomass or plant biomass in a system, increases with increasing temperature. And that this increase in this resource availability with temperature can kind of confound our predictions, and this prediction specifically of a temperature invariance, such that we can kind of rethink this, not necessarily as a temperature invariance of secondary production, but as a resource dependence, right? So rather than having this prediction that temperature affects secondary production, we can just really ignore temperature and just understand these resource dynamics. And then we can start to predict these patterns of energy flow through communities. And this prediction has really gone untested widely, and so that's really what we set out to do in this example. And to do so, we use this natural laboratory in Iceland. And so this is the Hengil Natural Laboratory, we call it. It's located in southwestern Iceland, right outside of Reykjavik, right here in the Hengil Valley. And so what characterizes this Iceland in general is a very active geothermal processes. And so it creates this kind of gradient of temperature over a really small spatial scale. And so if we look at just this valley, which I can walk from here to here in about 25 minutes, we can see within this valley we have temperatures that range from 5 Celsius and on the right outside of here on to 25 Celsius, and there are even some streams in here that are upwards of 50 Celsius. And so you have this really, really wide gradient in a really, really small geographical area. And importantly, they share the same groundwater pool, and so the solute concentration is very similar, so you don't have confounding effects of nutrient availability or anything like that. And they have relatively stable temperature regimes over decadal and sometimes century-long timescales. And so you kind of get away from these short-term effects and kind of focus on kind of long-term dynamics of these systems. And so what we did is we chose a subset of these systems, trying to kind of standardize some of the plant communities. And then we can see that of the 6 streams that we chose, we see clearly there's this wide temperature gradient that exists at the annual level, so from 5 Celsius to 25, 27 Celsius. And importantly, even during the winter periods, you see the maintenance of this temperature gradient, right? So even during the winter, these things are still maintained because they're geothermally heated. They're heated from the groundwater themselves. And so we can use this kind of natural experiment to ask some questions about streams and how they operate. And so in each of these streams, we quantified secondary production of the macroinvertebrate communities throughout the year. And we did this through empirically determining growth rates and then calculated secondary production over seasonal timescales. And you can see a little bit of what these systems look like. Here's some pictures from the sampling. So we're at 66 degrees north. We're right at the Arctic Circle. So during the winter, we're digging through meters of snow. And some of these, especially the warmer systems, you get these little caves of these little stream caves. So there's a stream running right through there that I'm sitting right next to. But you can access these systems even though they're completely covered with feet and feet and feet of snow. All right, and so to test the temperature dependence of secondary production, what we did is we had to correct for biomass, or correct for the mass dependence of biomass and PDB rates. So we did this through using the mean community biomass and then essentially dividing by this scaling, this exponent of 0.25 essentially. And then we quantified our resource availability through chlorophyll A concentrations as well as gross primary production estimates, so how much primary production occurs through time. All right, and this is a reminder for me to take a quick drink. But these are some of the conditions that we're dealing with. I kind of miss some of them, especially during the Texas summers. But let's start looking at what we found. And so starting at the lowest levels of organization that we measured, the individual. So now we're looking at individual production or growth rates. And so metabolic theory predicts that these things should scale with mass to about the negative 0.25 exponent. And with temperature, in this Arrhenius equation, in this case it's inverse, and so this negative exponent actually means positive response with temperature, but this should be about the slope that we should expect, 0.65 in this case. And so here we have just the growth rates, individual growth rates measured in the field and across body size, and this is just the raw data plotted. And we see that there's a pattern of, at least in the raw data, there's a pattern of this negative kind of trend there. And when we look at the kind of multivariate, so we look at the marginal effects of what the effects once we account for temperature, the mass scaling exponent is pretty close to what we predict by metabolic theory. So it's about negative 0.18, so it's a little shallower than the theory would predict, but pretty darn close, and it falls pretty close within the 95% bounds. Now when we look at the temperature effects, we see very clearly again, we see this increasing trend, and that this mean field, this mean response of growth rates with temperature after you account for the role of body size is right spot on to what we predict based on the metabolic theory, right? So at least at the individual scale, the metabolic theory seems to predict fairly well the individual growth rates. Oh, did I forget? Oh yeah, so individual production generally follows metabolic theory. Now let's scale this up and start thinking about communities. So here we got, in this case, our two products, or two variables that make up secondary production. On the top, we have biomass. On the bottom, we have biomass turnover, right? So our P to B ratio. And then just to remind everyone what our predictions were based on the metabolic theory for these processes. We see, when we look at these two graphs, we see that, at least qualitatively, there's agreement between what we predict and what we observe. And so, at least from a qualitative state, they're both going in the same direction. We have maybe some suggestion that this invariance might actually be holding. And so remembering that, again, though, that secondary production is the product of these two. So let's actually multiply them out. Let's put it together and calculate this and look at that. See if it's actually invariant like we predict. And what we see very clearly is that these predictions do not hold, at least in a quantitative sense. We see this very clear positive effect of temperature on secondary production of the community level. And it's very much not, when you look at the slope, it's very much not zero. So this is our estimate of our slope. This slope is not zero like we predict based on the base metabolic theory and this temperature dependence. But we have to think about this assumption that we laid out at the beginning. What is resource supply doing? And so when we look at, now we're just looking at secondary production versus our proxy of resource supply, so chlorophyll A. And we see that very clearly these two are connected to each other at least. So secondary production and chlorophyll A are at least related to each other. And when you look at the kind of log-log slope, it's pretty much on 1, so this kind of suggests that they're scaling linearly together. And once you account for this effect of resource availability and then look at the effects of if there's anything left for temperature to explain, we see that once we correct for resources, temperature has no further influence on the role of temperature has no further role on secondary production in these communities across systems. And so we have some support for this resource dependence of secondary production and no real role of temperature, at least at the annual level across systems. However, let's break in to are these systems seasonally and see if there's anything left to explain that we might be missing at the annual scale. So now when we look just over the course of a year, so here's secondary production on a daily scale. Over the course of a year, a few things really pop out. First, there's certainly seasonality within a system. So there's this peak during the summer, and there's this kind of wide gradient that exists between our coldest and our warmest systems. However, when you look at some times of the year, specifically the beginning and end, despite the fact that these temperature gradients exist and they still are maintained, there's really the difference between our coldest and our warmest system is really reduced, right? In these periods of the year, the difference that we see in our warmest system and our coldest system are minimal, and that happens to coincide when these streams look like this, right? It's middle of the winter, 66 degrees north. There's essentially no sunlight anymore, so these things are in the dark. And so how that plays out is when you look at the role of temperature on kind of the temperature dependence of secondary production within a system. Now, here again, secondary production, temperature. Here's our prediction that we saw before correcting for before correcting for resources at the annual scale. There's our prediction, our observation. And within a system, the secondary production shows a much stronger dependence on temperature, apparent dependence on temperature. So much steeper increases in production with temperature for the majority of the systems. But again, we know that there's a strong seasonal variability, and there's certainly seasonal variability in our resources that are available. And so when we think about this again, we have this kind of steeper temperature dependence within a stream seasonally. And we see this clear pattern that emerges with, now we're just looking at temperature and chlorophyll A. So temperature and our resource availability, we have this positive effect at an annual scale and this wide variability that exists within a system. And so we can use these data to then try to get a better handle on what resource availability is. And we have to take into account a few other things besides just the standing stock. We know that sun availability really is important for driving primary production, and that there exists this temperature dependence that in the rates of primary production within these systems. And so we can use these things and we can model what primary productivity is rather than just a standing stock. We can measure the flux of that process and then use that to correct for our resource availability within a system seasonally and see if there's anything left that temperature explains. And again, what we see is that once we account for resource availability within a stream, we again take away all that temperature dependence that we thought we observed originally, and we can account for all of that with the resource availability and the dynamics of that within and across systems. And so to kind of wrap up this first bit and take everything, we saw that community or consumer production showed a strong resource dependence across timescales, so both across streams and within streams. So temperature was still important, right? In terms of controlling some of those patterns. We saw that temperature or biomass decreased with temperature, primary or P/B ratios increased with temperature. So there's still a role that temperature is controlling individual rates of metabolism and growth. But these predictions about metabolic theory, they apply at certain levels, so that some of the individual level, they seem to hold pretty well. But when you start to scale up to higher levels of organization, those predictions get overwhelmed by the dynamics of resources within the system. And this last bit, resource dynamics are crucial to understanding how the energy flow in systems operates in the context of warming. And this is some work we published recently in, well, not recently anymore, I guess, in Ecology Letters. Now, this is, I think, the biggest takeaway from this is that resources are acting as this higher level control on energy flow. And given what we know that resources can be really important, this leads us to think about how do these systems kind of operate. They're unique systems. They're at the top of the world, but they also have this weird temperature gradient. So they allow us to kind of decouple sunlight availability and temperature within a small spatial scale, and we can start to think about what the warming Arctic might look like, for instance. And we know that these effects of warming, specifically on the stability of the resources and the consumers and their dynamic to each other, is predicted to, we really have no idea what warming is supposed to do with the stability of ecosystems. There's predictions all out there, depending on what model you use, that suggest that temperature should increase stability, should decrease stability, or not have no effect on the stability of consumer resource interactions. And we also know that warming, where it's happening, is not uniform. So most of the warming that's happening is happening at the high latitudes, specifically, the Arctic. And while we're increasing temperatures, the sunlight availability is not changing at all, right? Sunlight, and sunlight is going to stay constant in terms of its relative availability through time. And so this unique system allows us to ask some of these questions about what a future Arctic might look like, and specifically how stability of these ecosystems might be maintained. And so when we think about this kind of in a cartoon manner, we can start to make some predictions of what we expect, right? So here's an example of some ecosystem in the northern latitudes or southern latitudes, so high latitude systems. We generally as we move from winter through summer, we see this increase in light availability, which likely drives the resource availability that we see. We can start by comparing what we expect to see with a cold and warm system. So in our cold system, where we might have consumer energy demands that are driven by temperature, at these colder systems, these periods of energetic deficits, so when resources are really low because of low light availability, but consumer demand is really determined by temperature, these periods are really relatively small in a cold system. But as you start to warm a system or you're dealing with a hot system, that creates a kind of a different dynamic, right? So at these really, if temperature-driven metabolic demands are really high, and you're dealing with this seasonality and resource availability, you end up getting these really large energy deficits, right? That while in this cold system, this small deficit you might be able to make it through the winter by cannibalizing your body stores or something like that. At these warmer temperatures, these become much more difficult to deal with, these energetic deficits in a seasonal system. And so we might predict that at least in warmer temperatures, you see this stronger coupling between resource availability and energetic demands of the consumer community, right? So because this energetic deficit is so strong, it creates this really strong selection pressure, and then in order to maintain any semblance of ecosystem function, that energetic demand has to kind of be molded to and coupled to resource availability. And so let's test some of these predictions, knowing that we have some of these data to address these questions. And so we're just going to kind of show you how I'm going to go about this. We're connecting the dots here. We're going to take our seasonal patterns of resource availability and consumer energy demand. We're going to couple it with diet content and understanding these relationships between consumers and their resources and what they're eating. And then we're going to look at this, specifically calculate the interaction strengths of each of these, of consumers on resources, and then track this interaction strength and see how that changes throughout the year. And so this, by kind of tracking this interaction strength here, we can make some predictions about what these seasonal patterns might look like, depending on how coupled or decoupled consumer demand and resource availability are. And so here are a few of those predictions. If you have consumer and resources that are tightly coupled to each other, are completely coherent, you actually have this prediction that's interaction strength, so the top-down effect of consumers on resources should be fairly constant throughout the year. Now, this other example where you have kind of this ramp up of consumer demand and potentially an overshoot of resource availability, which you might expect in some predator-prey models or some consumer resource models, gives you this distinct pattern of this concave effect of an interaction strength through time. And on this other bit, maybe at some of these colder temperatures, if you have this constant resource demand and consumer demand is constant throughout the year, you should see this convex relationship through time where you have and so these three kind of qualitative patterns, we can look across our temperature gradient and see how it looks with increasing temperature. So let's walk through an example of what this looks like. So we have three plots here, and we're going to kind of walk through time, but here's an example. Here's our dynamics of consumer demand. Here's our patterns of resource availability. Here are just this pretty food web of all the different consumers and their consumption of different resources. And then we're going to track, this is the important plot over here, we're going to track this median interaction strength as kind of a proxy for the strength of top-down interaction, making this assumption and this connection that stronger interaction strengths should be more destabilizing in systems. All right, let's walk through this cartoon. We see that as we move through the year, demand changes and gets shunted to different consumers throughout the year. But when we follow this line here, this median interaction strength, despite the variability that does exist, this thing is essentially unmoved in this case, in this example. So we have pretty much a constant interaction strength throughout the year. And what this looks like on just a plot on the day of the year versus interaction strength here, and this is our warmest system, we see that plays out to a pretty consistent straight line throughout the year. Now let's look at the rest of our systems. What we see is that there's certainly variability. But we see pretty much all three of the qualitative forms of what our interaction strengths through time show. Right? Our warmest systems are relatively flat and actually on average a little bit higher. We have this stream 9 here, which is kind of our mid-range temperature, which kind of has this convex pattern. These patterns here, they suggest maybe this ramp up and overshoot that exists. And then this is kind of all over the place. But we can look at this and just look at the variability within it. So just take the measure of the standard deviation of this interaction strength throughout the year and plot that against temperature. And so this should give us some evidence to suggest that in warmer systems, the interaction strengths are less variable, suggesting stronger coupling between resources and consumer demand throughout the year. All right. And so another thing another interesting aspect that pops out from this is that we see a little bit stronger interaction strength on average. And if you think about what an interaction strength is essentially like how much pressure there is from a consumer on a resource. So it's essentially kind of a proxy of the flux of energy or biomass from a resource to a consumer. And so we should expect, consumer pressure is higher at temperatures. We should expect that higher, that in systems that have higher interaction strengths, that more of that flux from resources to consumer gets put into consumer biomass. So it should shift the relative abundance of consumer biomass in the system versus resource biomass in a system. However, when we look at the ratio of consumer to resource biomass throughout the year, we see few things that pop out. First off, our warmer systems have similarly consistent consumer resource biomass ratios. And often, our warmer systems have lower consumer resource biomass. So despite the fact that there's a stronger flux from resources to consumers, it doesn't manifest in more relative biomass of the consumers, right? It doesn't get translated into standing biomass of the consumers themselves in our warmer systems. And so this is a little confusing. We would expect those systems with higher interaction strengths to have a higher consumer to resource biomass ratio. And so in order to dig into this a little bit more, we're going to simplify these systems a bit. And so what we saw there was this kind of complex food network. What we're going to do then is partition this into biomass groups, and then simplify it even further and just look at this as a consumer resource model. The utility of this is it allows us to kind of pull on this long history of consumer resource models, such as Lotka-Volterra models or Rosenzweig, MacArthur models, and quantify these dynamics in terms of their temporal dynamics through time. And we know we can leverage the fact that these have been well studied to understand stability in consumer resource dynamics for almost a century now. And so we can use these to kind of understand why are we not seeing that transfer of biomass to consumers. And so some of this is relatively recent work that has shown that we can kind of use these hyperparameters these higher level parameters that take specific parameters within these consumer resource models, and then predict essentially what the consumer to resource biomass ratio should be. And this hyperparameter here, which we call BCR, takes 4 different parameters from these consumer resource models. And essentially, it's this top, the numerator, is how efficiently can a consumer turn resource biomass into itself relative in a context of the resource accumulation rate. And this denominator here is the consumer mortality, so it's essentially the loss of biomass from the consumers. And so the ratio of this gives us kind of this potential flux of consumers to resources, right? And how do we increase the BCR, right? We can think about this. We know that if we decrease the consumer loss, we decrease the denominator, this increases, or if we increase any of these 3. And what we know is that efficiency is pretty constant with temperature. Clearance rate is a little unknown what it does. It's probably, we'll just assume that it stays constant. But we know that resource accumulation rate increases because we know GPP increases with temperature. And so we actually have this prediction that this ratio should increase with temperature because we know that resource accumulation is increasing. We don't know much about this consumer mortality term. But when we play this out, we see this opposite pattern where we see a strong effect and a strong relationship between this BCR parameter and temperature. And the only way this happens is if mortality is increasing faster than the accumulation, so faster than the carrying capacity of resources. And so there's really strong evidence of self-selection and self-regulation in these systems, and that is increasing in our warmer systems. So warmer systems have a stronger feedback of the consumers through time. All right, so I'm going to push through these really quickly. But what this final thing, I'm going to delve into one more little vignette, asking some questions about how these patterns with stability and resource function, or ecosystem function and consumer resource stability might relate to functions of biodiversity or dimensions of biodiversity, and asking a few questions specifically that, thinking that this tighter coupling of consumer resource dynamics might be a kind of a way that systems maintain ecosystem function in the face of these really dynamic resource availability systems. And thinking about what species traits might allow for this to occur, allow for these conditions of high ecosystem function and highly variable resource availability, especially at warmer temperatures. And then can we see the imprint of the selective pressures that this leaves on these communities, right? And so for getting into our first kind of question, we know that warmer systems have more resource availability and they have more total ecosystem function, so the amount of energy that flows through these systems is higher at higher temperatures. So we have this example where these warmer systems are maintaining ecosystem function, and there's really not there's not a clear loss of efficiency or anything like that that we observe. So how does this strong coupling occur, right? We know that in order to match this rate of resource availability, you need fast growth rates and high reproduction. And then to mirror this reduction in resource availability in the winter season or the fall season, you need this strong self-regulation and this high mortality which we observed, or which we inferred existed from our consumer resource models. And so this should have distinct imprints on the communities and the traits that we see in the communities. So we're just going to look really quickly about a few traits, specifically thinking about how warmer systems should have lower body sizes and higher production of biomass ratios, at least across systems, and that we should see some stronger trait selection at warmer temperatures. And so in order to look at that within a system, we can look at kind of how, within communities, how these species traits relate to the ranking of energy use within a species. So if we think about, if we were to align species based on their rank energy use and look at how a trait axis relates to that, we can think about one example where it's just unrelated, relatively speaking. You know, there's just no clear relationship. On the other side, we can think of that species rank might be negatively related with species traits. Or in another case, it might be positive. And so we can look at these patterns within a community to start to think about how at least selection might be, or not selection per se, but how these community assembly processes might be favoring certain species traits. All right, so first off, let's look at our cross-system example. Clearly, when we look at temperature, in this case, we're looking at population mean body size on the y-axis here, and there's a very clear pattern of smaller individual species at warmer temperatures. And also when we look at the population production to biomass ratio, so the turnover of these species with temperature, we see a very clear trend of increasing turnover with temperature. And so across systems, we see these imprints of our predicted traits in this case, or trait responses, decreasing body size, increasing P to B. And we know that these are related to each other. Now, how do we compare apples to apples, right? We know that there's, given this order of magnitude difference in turnover rate, how do we compare that how do we compare two communities that just generally have different values? One way we can do this to compare within communities is think about this in a relative sense. So if we look at relative cumulative species on the x-axis versus some cumulative flux on the y-axis, and then we can order these species based on trait values. So we can order them based from lowest body size to highest body size, or from lowest turnover rate to highest turnover rate, and then look at how this accumulation operates or looks across those different trait gradients. And so kind of thinking back to this neutral effect, what we expect is that this line should follow this kind of negative or neutral effect here. If we think that there's a negative correlation, that there's a high accumulation of flux in these at these lower values, so these species that are highly energy consuming fall essentially at these low trait values, so there's a negative relationship. And the other relationship we can see is this kind of negative accumulation. So at these high trait values, that's where you see the majority of the flux entering in. And the relationship between essentially what side of this neutral line these empirical accumulation or rank accumulation curves falls gives us an estimate of kind of how skewed communities are towards certain trait values. And so we're looking at just P to B. So this is the production to biomass ratio, or the turnover rate of these species. And here we have these Lorenz curves, or these kind of trait accumulation curves. So on the y-axis is just the cumulative flux in a relative sense from 0 to 1. And then on the x-axis is the increase, they're ordered from lowest P to B to highest P to B, and so the relative accumulation of species. And we can see from our highest systems, we see kind of this negative, or this open sloping up effect. And then in our coldest systems and our medium systems, it become more close to kind of neutral. And then in this coldest systems, we actually see kind of this completely opposite effect. And so this allows us to compare, in this case, systems that have 40 species to systems that have 10 species in a kind of a standardized way to see how skewed these trait distributions are relative to the cumulative flux. And so we see that in this case, energy fluxes are highly skewed towards higher P to B at mid to warm temperatures. So as you move from our coldest temperature to our warmest temperature, we see this very positive skew in our flux distribution. But one thing that we don't necessarily know is that we know that each of these communities have, they naturally have unevenness within them. And given that there's 40 species in some communities and 10 species in other communities, we don't know to the extent to which these patterns that we observe just arise from random, right? And so we can build kind of this neutral lottery model and just randomize these things and look at the distribution of our values of skew in a random distribution versus the ones that we observe in our empirical communities, and look at essentially like a probability or a p-value of how likely we are to observe these empirical values relative to the random distribution. And so when we look at that, we see that, so anything, we can kind of think about this as a distribution here, like, a Gaussian distribution. So anything at these tails and these lower, near the axis or near the top axis, anything at those extremes is a really has an event of low probability. And so what this shows is that at cooler and mid temperatures, the flux distribution that we see is essentially random relative to these trait distributions. But as we increase in temperature, we start to see that this becomes less likely to be observed just randomly. And so this gives us some insight that maybe at these warmer temperatures, there's a stronger selection pressure within these communities towards organisms that have higher turnover and lower body size. And so there's stronger selections for higher turnover at warmer temperatures. And so just to take what the main takeaways from this are is we're seeing this clear decrease in body size and increase in biomass turnover. And these warmer food webs shunt energy through through higher turnover species, and this occurs in a non-random fashion. And then again, these temperature resource interactions are really key to understanding the effects of warming on systems. And this is something we just published recently in Ecology. And just to wrap this up, kind of try to bring everything together. When we think about what the future effects of warming might be on the planet, we need to start thinking about this not necessarily as in conjunction of just warming itself, but thinking about how warming and the speed of warming occurs relative to kind of the natural dynamics of the system. These systems are inherently variable. And so how do we think about these different systems that have different temporal changes and temporal scales, from a cicada emergence that happens on really slow events versus a latitudinal light gradient that happens over an annual cycle? How do these relate to other drivers of systems that might speed up consumer demands or slow down consumer demands relative to this internal forcing of ecosystem variability, and then how that relates to this concept of stability or unstable effects of warming. And so ultimately, stability is going to depend on the rate of forcing so the rate of forcing of demand relative to the underlying dynamics of the system. So with that, I will wrap up. I'll thank a bunch of people that helped with this work, and I'll take any questions. Yeah. Yes?
I have a question rolling back to kind of your methodology.
Yep.
Working in Iceland. So you had this extreme gradient that during a period of the year, the entire gradient was subject to this mass influx of precipitation.
Yep.
Snowfall. Did the snow melt that happened affect the streams? Because I imagine that if you have an influx of this snow melt, it's going to lower the temperatures in these high temperature areas.
Yes. Yeah, so thinking about the role of runoff and snowmelt on the especially the temperature regimes of these systems, the nice thing about them is that because they're headwater systems, right? Most of them you can stand across to sample, and so they're mostly spring fed. Many of them have really small watersheds, and so while they might have this massive amount of snow that does accumulate, in a sense, it's not that much snow relative to because the watershed is so small, and so it runs off and it does lower temperature for a few days or or a short amount of time, but it doesn't have this massive effect on the kind of average temperature regime. And you can kind of see it if we look at back. You can kind of see it play out here. Where you see this variability, the summer variability is a little bit more, it's a little bit less than some of these systems that are jumping all over the place during the winter and spring. And so it does play out, but it's not that big of an importance of things like mountain-fed systems that have these big flushing flows that reorganize the bed and stuff like that.
Well, thank you. That answered.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
So, I noticed that this is very much specific to ecosystems that do experience seasons. I'm
Yes.
just curious to hear your thoughts about how would this information about temperature apply to places that are already very warm?
Yes. It's curious that you mentioned that, because since I've moved here, that's been a question that I have myself. And I think one of the things that you see especially important for areas like Texas is that, and you're starting to see it more and more all over the place, is that with warming, you're seeing an increase in drought and some of those other things. And so the actually interesting aspect is that the effects of warming in terms of decreasing body size and increasing turnover and life history speed of the organisms actually might make the communities with them in them more resilient to drought. That's I think, a kind of a key, a cool takeaway that I think that some of this shows. And in likely cases where places that are really hot, I think we start to see that things like drought and other aspects become much more important. And the reason I mentioned that the drought and temperature interactions is because my PhD advisor actually is back in this system, specifically manipulating drought to try to answer that question. And so in 4 to 5 years, someone else might be here giving a talk on that, maybe, I don't know.